Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. It's me Andre, your bookworm, and today we have another book review as usual, but we're jumping into science fiction. So we're doing something slightly different than the usual because we have so much fantasy. So let's go for science fiction. But before we jump into that, don't forget, subscribe, like the content, and comment down below if you've ever read any of these three books, which are Hyperion, The Fall of Hyperion, and Endymion, which is the one we're reviewing today. So like I said, we're diving into science fiction with Endymion, which is the third book of the Hyperion Cantos. This series has 4 books published, so we're almost reaching the end. And this was published by Simmons. And I know it's been quite a while since I reviewed the second book, but I finally got to the third one, and I'm glad that I did because I have great things to say about it. So let's jump into the review and let's start with our details. If you haven't seen my reviews for the previous books, I'll have the thumbnails here with the cards showing up at the top. Go watch those. If you haven't watched, go watch them, see what I rate them, and see what my opinion of each one is, because I think Hyperion was an excellent book, and The Fall of Hyperion was a pretty good book as well, except it has some issues, but I go into more detail in that specific video. But so what about Endymion? Endymion was published in 1996. It won the Locus Award the year after, and on Goodreads it has over 61,000 ratings. And it stands with a score of 4.19 out of 5, which is, again, a very good score. And we love seeing books with more than 4 stars out of 5 on Goodreads. Now, of course, we're going to jump into the synopsis. If you don't want to hear anything about it, especially because this is the third book of the series, then jump into the timestamp. It's floating around. Otherwise, if you want to know what this book is about, just stick around and you'll be hearing it. 274 years after the fall of the World Web in Fall of Hyperion, Endymion is sent on a quest. Retrieving Enia from the Sphinx before the church troops reach her is only the beginning. With help from a blue-skinned android named Vic, and Enia travel the river Tethys, pursued by Father Captain Frederick, an influential warrior priest and his troops. The Shrike continues to make enigmatic appearances, and while many questions were raised in Hyperion and Fall of Hyperion, still more are raised here. Roll's quest will continue. Now, I think the synopsis is quite engaging. It doesn't reveal much, just the premise at the start, and it really grips you and hooks you in to explore this book. But before we actually go into the review, here are just the scores for the first 2 books so that you can have a small comparison with what I think were the strong points and the weak points of the first 2 books, and then compare with this third book. So like I mentioned earlier, we had a little drop from the first to the second book, but then again, both books have amazing scores. Going from a 4.8 to a 4.4, it's still amazing to continue above 4, right? So the only thing that I thought was a bit weaker in the second book compared to the first one was the characters and the enjoyment. And the enjoyment was partially because the characters dropped. So I hope that with this one, if it improves the characters, then my enjoyment will improve as well. But let's jump into the actual review in the categories and see what happens. So starting with plot, and like the synopsis says, and this is not a spoiler, it's just a setup of the third book, we start this book hundreds of years after the events of the second one. Which, I gotta be honest, left me a bit confused at the start. I was a bit like, what is happening? I'm not understanding very well, but once I fully understood what time we were set up, then it was easy for me to continue. The other detail that I actually think it might be a bit more on the writing style category than on the plot, but this story is told as if it was a character in the future telling us the events that happened, similar to The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. You know, that archetype, that trope of the retelling of a story. But on top of that, this story is mainly a hero's journey. We follow our main hero and their companions going through this quest and discovering new worlds and facing dangers and adventures, and I really love that setting in a sci-fi genre. I think in the fantasy genre, it's not as effective for me, even though some people love, like Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman's Dragonlance Chronicles. Those are very similar in the sense that it's a hero's journey, but for me, for some reason, not as engaging. In Endymion, I love it, and I think it's because they can explore completely different worlds, planets, and that, I don't know, brings some different excitement. And I think this reminds me a lot of one of the plot lines of Pandora's Star, which is another book I reviewed here that I simply loved, and one of the plot lines is quite similar or has some similarities with Endymion. So I really love the plot, and because of that, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 5. And I want to say that there were times where the plot seemed that it was going to be predictable. I thought it was going to go a certain way, and I was proven wrong several times, which I love because it means that it's not that predictable, and the author is not afraid to take left turns and just guide us along it and just make us be in the expectation of what is about to happen. So I think that was also part of the reason why I gave a 5. What about the characters? Well, because this book is set hundreds of years after the fall of Hyperion, one is to expect that the characters will be new, all or pretty much all new. However, what I found fascinating, and this is partially related with world building, is that we see the effects that the characters in Fall of Hyperion had in these hundreds of years and how the world developed to form the new characters. But aside from that, speaking specifically of our main protagonists, about Roll and Ania, I thought they were good. They were not amazing. I thought Roll was a bit better than Ania, and that's because Ania felt a bit too mystical or too vague for my liking. I know she is purposely done like that because you're not supposed to know everything about her, and she's this mystical figure, and I think in the next book it will be when we discover more about her. But I don't know, it wasn't vibing well enough for me. And especially because I thought all the other characters, even secondary characters like Aebetic or other characters that I won't mention, were more multifaceted. Or, for example, Frederica de Soya, the warrior priest, I thought it had several dimensions to him, and they were quite good, and I could see an evolution throughout the book. So for this category, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. Now moving on to world building, I already mentioned a bit about this, but I think it's really great to see the effects a book or the events in one book have in the future of that universe. And we see this especially with the Cruciform, for example, something that showed up in the first and second books, and how that created such a big impact and transformed this universe so much that it now completely shapes the events of this story. I love when an author thinks of its universe as a evolving thing and not just this stagnant world that stays always the same, which tends to happen more in fantasy rather than science fiction. But yeah, I like when there is an evolution of the world. And the other thing that I love is that even though we've explored so much in these 3 books, you still feel like there's so much still to explore and so many questions yet unanswered. So it's amazing. It feels like there's a whole pot of mysteries yet to digest, and I think that engages the reader to keep reading and to go to the next book and the next one. So for this category, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 5. Because in the end, the universe feels rich, it feels dense, there's so many planets, so many cultures, so many factions, that creates a natural complexity to the universe, which helps us relate to the characters and to the world itself. As for writing style, I truly enjoyed how Dan Simmons was able to write this book having the right quantities of everything. Descriptions, emotions, action, everything was just done in the right quantity. I think the explanation of the science was good, it wasn't too much. The description of the landscapes and the worlds was good, again, not too much. Having some drama or some intrigue or some tension between characters was also very well done. It was done at the right moments and the right amount. It was never too much to feel like a soap opera. And on top of that, Dan Simmons still explores questions like moral questions, philosophical questions that we as readers are supposed to think about. There's no particular right answer, but we can think and imagine what we would do in those situations. And I think it's very hard to do that without seeming that we're having a sermon told to us. But Dan Simmons was able to do that very, very well. And of course, while having still amazing quotes, like this one, for example, there's no spoilers, it just says, "If God exists, it is a painkiller." So for this category, I'm also going to give a 5 out of 5. Finally, enjoyment. I enjoy this book a lot, as you can see. I can see now that I'm a sucker for these plot lines where you go from one place to the next, but only in science fiction. Like I mentioned, for some reason fantasy doesn't work as well for me. Of course, it helped that the characters and the world building and the plot itself were good, and they were all in some parts amazing. I'm really glad that I've reached this point in the series, and I cannot wait to read the next book to see how this arc ends. I mean, while I was reading this book, I was trying to find all excuses to just stop and read a couple more pages and then do whatever I needed to do. So for this category, it's going to be a 5 out of 5. And so we reached the end of our review. So just to refresh, and the scores will be here together with the scores of the first and second books. For Endymion, we gave a 5 for plot, 4 for characters, and then 5 for world building, 5 for writing style, and 5 for enjoyment, which gives us a final score of 4.8. So it's clear that this book went back to its glory for the whole series, and this series so far has an amazing average score, going from 4.8 to 4.4 to 4.8 again. So really good job, Ben Simmons. Of course, this also means that I am enjoying this series a lot more than the average good reader, because my score is quite higher than the score that Gurries has of 4.19. Do with that what you may. If you think my opinion is worth more than the average, then go. I recommend this book. I totally recommend the whole series, so go for it. If not, if you still read the first one and the second one and you don't think it's for you, what I can say is that this is almost like a completely different arc. You might want to give it a try and see if you like this one. I think these books are a great mix between modern and the classical sci-fi. It has a bit of both. The characters are not as boring or not as second or background as classical sci-fi. They're also not the foreground like modern sci-fi is. So you gotta choose what you prefer, of course, but I think it's worth a risk. And if you've tried already, if you risked already reading this book, then let me know. Comment down below, what did you think of this book? What was your score? If you haven't read it, are you keen to read it? Let me know in the comments. And if you're new, don't forget, subscribe, like the content, and you'll be seeing me on Thursdays and Sundays, right? See you soon.